Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. John Kinder, who is Director of American Studies and Professor of History at Oklahoma State University. He is the author of Paying It With Their Bodies, American War and the Problem of the Disabled Veteran, and co-editor of Service Denied, Marginalized Veterans in Modern American History. John Kinder, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate your having me here today.
Likewise, John, I have really been looking forward to this discussion. And to our audience, John, so let's see, we've had over 200 episodes now of this podcast, and John is the very first guest who I met on a plane. I was sitting next to John. Let's see, my family and I were returning from Arkansas this spring, where we saw the eclipse, which ran through the United States, and it was that was a pretty awesome experience. But anyway, we were flying home back to Portland, Oregon, and John was sitting next to me on the plane, and I struck up a conversation like, "Hey, how you doing? What do you do?" All, et cetera, et cetera. And he started describing to me his latest book, which we're going to get into here in just a moment. And I thought, this is going to make a fascinating Cognitive Crucible podcast. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, John, will cover your latest book entitled World War Zoos, Humans and Other Animals in the Deadliest Conflict of the Modern Age. And by the way, another little sidebar here. When I got my graduate degree from the Naval Postgraduate School, my thesis advisor gave me a great piece of advice. And he said, basically, you're going to do some writing here as part of your graduate education, but you're probably going to write more as you continue on with your professional life. And his advice was, just because you're writing something that is serious or it's technically rigorous, et cetera, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be engaging or interesting or creative, right? And so I thought of that when when you described your book, but also the title, right? World War Zoos. I mean, what an awesome title, John.
Well, it's a title that I think can reach out and grab pretty much any reader, right? So we have World War, and we have zoos, right? And it asks you to kind of imagine what happens when the two come together, really. And that's sort of what the book is about.
Yeah.
The subtitle I also I'm pretty proud of as well, humans and other animals, because, one thing that I want to show in the book is that, we think about zoos and we think about, they're a place where we see animals. But of course, zoos are built for humans. They're run by humans. And you can't tell the story of zoos during World War II without talking about all the people, the visitors, the zookeepers, the zoo directors, the politicians who interacted with the zoo as well. So yeah, it's a title that I think kind of tries to sum up everything.
Yeah, that's cool. And in typical fashion, I got us a little waylaid off of the typical opening sequence for the podcast. So let me circle back up. So, but before we get into your book, could we get your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Okay, well, as a new fan of your podcast, I have to say that, I think I'm a bit different from a lot of your guests. I'm, just to be upfront, I'm a historian, right? That means that I tend to look backwards as I try to make sense of the present, right? So I'm not sure I can speak to the strategic landscape as a whole, but when I first thought about this question, I couldn't help but think about the 1930s, right? The 1930s is a period that I've spent a long time thinking about. It's a period in which we see global economic insecurity, right? We see a rise of militant nationalism around the world, right? And most famously, we're talking about Nazi Germany or fascist Italy or Imperial Japan. But of course, you see these movements in other places, right? It's a time in which we see this kind of global turn away from democracy, or at least a skepticism of a kind of liberal democracy as it had been, or as we think about it today, and it's a period in which we see a number of these strongman type leaders emerging on the global scene, and it was a period in which, you really see this transition from this kind of 19th century environment where, even though there was global trade, you still kind of thought about things in nationalist terms, to a really kind of reckoning with the idea that all of the world's problems are international problems. They're intersecting with each other. And with for a lot of people who found themselves left behind or struggling or out of work or unable to really reconcile their lives with the economic environment, like that's a difficult time. And so I see a lot of parallels there, right, for good or ill. That said, over the past, decade, working on this book and others as well, I've been increasingly attuned to the environment. And as far as the environment is concerned, I think we're in a really bad place, right? I'm not a climate doomist. Climate doomist is a term that for people who basically resign themselves that, the world is erratically messed up, right? And we have to reconcile ourselves with the idea of just sort of simply living in a more dangerous, hotter, a more disaster-prone environment. I'm not there yet, but we have to be upfront that we're not on pace to meet really any of our climate goals, which means we can only expect larger and larger climate-related disasters. And as someone who lives in Oklahoma, which is basically Tornado Alley, I'm very much aware of this danger, right? Right now in Azerbaijan, we've got COP29, which is this UN climate conference. And, coming out of that is a real sense of, that we are not going to, meet our goals and demands. I was just reading something today in which a UNICEF Assistant Secretary General said something about how climate change is having a disproportionate effect on children, right? Growing bodies have a harder time dealing with extreme heat, which leads to premature birth, childhood malnutrition, that sort of thing. And this is when we talk about things like the environment, it's easy to get abstract, but we speak a lot about immigration and refugees in contemporary politics, but we've done little to nothing to grapple with rising numbers of climate refugees, both inside the United States and outside. And I'm thinking about refugees from places like Houston or Katrina, or more recently Florida and North Carolina, as well as places like Guatemala. Refugees from storms, from heat, floods, fires. The Pentagon tells us that climate change is going to spark all kinds of military conflicts, episodes of civil unrest. We've got nations gobbling up resources of, including mineral resources of the sort that
Mm-hmm.
we need for electric cars and batteries. And meanwhile, you've got,
Right.
you know,
There's also the I would say the likelihood that there will be a a major increase in the amount of arable land, especially in the global north, right?
Oh, of
Like
course.
Canada, Greenland, the northern areas of the Soviet Union. I mean, okay, like there'll be the thawing of tundra, right? That's its own event. But following that, there will be a whole bunch of new agriculture available, which uh, changes the chessboard as well in ways that are difficult to predict.
And that's what makes climate change so difficult, right? Because we think about it as warming, but it is change. So yes, there are going to be winners and losers in the climate change in 21st century climate change, right? But unfortunately, a lot of the losers are going to be the folks who are already pretty, economically marginalized as it is, right?
Hmm.
And so we're going to see, yes, there might be opening up of arable land, right? But there's also going to be millions upon millions of people who find themselves stuck in famine and so forth. And I think for me, what is most dangerous about this is that, the only way we can really think through these things is through national and international cooperation, right? We need all parties on board, governments, nonprofits, businesses, environmental groups, and in our period of contemporary political polarization and message polarization, something that you know so much about. It's hard to see how we're ever going to get on board, right? We still have people who kind of think that this is all made up, or at the very least, it's a Chinese conspiracy, or simply just nature doing its own thing.
Hmm.
So, you know,
Yeah.
on one
Hmm.
hand, the historian in me kind of is thinking about the dangers of the 30s, the kind of environmentally American studies scholar in me is looking at this contemporary climate environment and seeing all kinds of worries and, zoos and zoo animals and wildlife are simply to use a cliche, the canaries in the coal mine
Is
when
that
it
right?
comes to these things.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Well, that's an interesting perspective for sure. And I tend to agree with you. Set aside the blame of climate change, set all that aside, and just make the assumption that there is a very likely future scenario about climate change, which um, should be forcing uh, scenario building and some sort of strategic, not strategic, strategy to manage through the challenge as you were
Mhm.
describing. So perhaps we can start getting into your book now. Okay, World War Zoos, humans and other animals in the deadliest conflict of the modern age. Why did you write this book?
Well, so there are a couple of reasons. One is, when people ask me what I do, I kind of like to think of myself as a historian of the home front, right? So I'm interested in the ways in which war leaves its mark on expected and unexpected places. And so I wrote a book years ago called Paying with Their Bodies, which is all about how war leaves its mark on the bodies of the people who fight, right? So on disabled veterans. And so, in my mind, that's one of the most expected places, right, on soldiers' bodies. And I point out how for disabled veterans, the war lingers in their bodies years afterwards. So, having done that, I was still interested in the same thing, but I was interested in a kind of unexpected place or a place that I would say, war has really shaped, but no one would really think of. And so that's when I settled on zoos. I've always been interested in zoos, but I can speak to a very specific moment when I knew that this was going to be something that I would obsess over for years, and that was when I was visiting the Berlin Zoo in the late 1990s, and during the 1930s, the Berlin Zoo was the biggest zoo in the world. It's still one of the biggest zoos. And it's in the center of Berlin. It's in this huge garden. It's still an impressive place, but when I visited, there was a memorial for zoo elephants that had died in World War II. There was even a photo showing the smashed pachyderm house, and you could see the rubble, and you could see the elephant's legs kind of peeking out through the rubble. But there was no real context for the image. It was just sort of there, right? There was no explanation of why the zoo was bombed or was it intentional or if the zoo played a role in the war effort. And what struck me at the time was the fact that, if you went to Germany, you didn't see war memorials, right? Because it's hard to memorialize a war in which you're universally viewed as the villain, right? It's hard to make a kind of Nazi era war memorial. But this one was different because memorializing the elephants were fair game. They were kind of, innocent. And so I kind of saw it as this kind of bait and switch, right? In which you could memorialize the war without having to bring up the Nazis. And this made me angry at the time because even then I knew that, well, Hitler's government took over the zoo, right? And so
This is again, John, you said this was in the early 1990s when you visited
this
Berlin?
was in the late 1990s.
Late 90s. Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, since seeing this and wondering, about what happened, this has always been in the back of my mind, and particularly this idea that, somehow like the deaths of these animals were being used to kind of, uh, resurrect this story of, German innocence in World War II. So that kind of got me thinking about this. And then I went off to grad school and worked on the disabled veteran book and some other things. But it was always in the back of my mind. So I knew I wanted to come back to it.
Okay. Wow. It's interesting how a seed gets planted, but and can kind of lay fallow or be just kind of biding its time until the right time to
It's exactly right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, well, yeah. So the title of this podcast is going to be World War Zoos and Propaganda, and that's really what hooked me when I was talking with you on the plane earlier this spring. But yeah, maybe we can start into more into the propaganda with something that is like more of a current topic with panda diplomacy.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about panda diplomacy and how it relates to animals, zoos, and propaganda?
Yeah, so sometimes people ask me when I say things like zoos are political or zoos
Mm,
are bound up in international politics. They'll say, "What are you talking about?"
mm,
And so one of the best examples I'll use is panda diplomacy, right? As an example of how kind of animals and zoos can be used as these tokens of propaganda. And it's a term that people basically use to describe the use of pandas as tools of international relations. And it's almost impossible to imagine today, but you know, pandas are known the world over. But in the 19th century, few people outside of China actually knew pandas existed, right? It wasn't until the 1930s when a socialite and animal collector named Ruth Harkness brought the first live panda to the United States. This set off a craze. It was inevitably called pandemonium. Um, uh, for the animals, right? So when the Bronx Zoo's panda died in 1941, it couldn't just order a new one, right? So in fact, in the first episode of Panda Diplomacy, the zoo reached out to Chiang Kai-shek um, to get a replacement, and the Chinese general knew that it was more than just doing a good favor, right? That by giving this panda to the United States, it could help cement friendly U.S.-Chinese relations. In fact, Madam Chiang went on CBS News and gave a radio address about the pandas, and I've got a great quote here. Where this is what she's talking about when she's talking about kind of what these pandas mean. She says, unlike the fascist nations which consider it fair game to victimize the weak and the unfortunate, America is now supporting justice and humanity as earnestly as who has fought and bled for these principles during the past 4 years. China's gift of a pair of chubby black and white comical furry pandas was just a small way of saying thank you, right? So, every time you go to the zoo, Madam Shang recognized like this would be sort of a symbol of the friendship between China and the United States. And, after Mao, took over China in the late 1940s, China cut off all access to pandas. In fact, during the Cold
Mm.
War, the State Department barred U.S. zoos from getting pandas from foreign intermediaries, describing them as communist goods. And so you would be, China would give pandas to places like Moscow. But,
Mm.
in the 1970s, this is when Richard Nixon broke down what was called the bamboo curtain.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, in
I've never heard it called. I've never heard it called that
yeah,
before.
it was the Iron Curtain, and then in China the bamboo curtain.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And was able to get pandas from China, and so this was kind of seen as like the panda. There was also ping pong diplomacy, right? This was Americans and Chinese playing ping pong as a place. So it's not the only kind of thing like that like this, but even to this day, the U.S. can't really own a panda. They can essentially are rented out for a few years until China takes them back. But nevertheless, they're able to put a happy face on the Chinese nation, and they're kind of this sort of tool, or this kind of instrument of this give and take relationship between China and the United States. And there are plenty of other examples like this, but these are the most famous animals used in diplomacy like this,
Hmm.
right?
Is
And
are there? I should know this, or maybe I shouldn't. But are there pandas currently in the United States on loan from China?
yes.
And what are the assumptions or the conditions, or what message is China trying to present to the world by virtue of this current like loan of these megafauna?
Well, I should really know this, where exactly the pandas are.
Yeah,
Every
yeah.
once in a while, you will hear they were in the National Zoo for the last few years, but then I want to say they were taken away. So, and I think the newest ones are in San Diego or San Francisco.
I'm looking it up right now.
Yeah.
According to Google in real time, so take that for what it's worth. The Atlanta Zoo,
Okay. Right.
Atlanta.
And
Yeah.
so rarely are there more than a few in the
Hmm.
United States at any one time. And, it's always a kind of uh, it has been used as a way to people to for people to get on China's side. So there will be letter writing campaigns. Please, can you bring zoo China pandas to our local zoo, right? And this becomes a way like, hey, U.S. government, be nice to China, be friendly to China, so that we can get. Interestingly, in fact, the Chinese government doesn't need zoos anymore, right? Because they've been so good at using the internet and video streams to stream, videos of pandas all around the world, right? So,
Oh,
people all around the world are able to, before then, like the only way you could ever see a panda was to have it in a zoo. But now, of course, China can sort of do these, 24-hour live streams of pandas.
right.
And really, if you watch these videos, they would make it seem like China is, just this friendly, animal loving, place where these funny pandas live, and they're always surrounded by happy visitors, right? And so, if you're looking for a place that is the sort of opposite of this, frightening view of China, this view of China as a potential superpower, just watch panda videos, right? Because they're, you know, you would say that they are specifically designed to put a happy, benign face
Mm.
on China and its people, right?
Yeah, almost as good as cat videos.
Oh no, like
Maybe
they're
better.
even better. Yeah.
Better, yeah, of course. Okay, well, excellent primer. So maybe we could get into some of the examples that you were recapping to me a couple of months ago about governments using zoos and animals for propaganda or morale boosting purposes during wartime.
Yeah. And, if you know anything about World War II, right, you know that basically most governments took over their local film industries. Well, they did something kind of similar with zoos. Now, sometimes it was a formal takeover, sometimes it was um, putting pressure or just putting the thumb on the scale of the local zoo. So, if you went to a zoo, you would be surrounded by various kinds of propaganda, war bond advertisements, posters, that sort of thing. But, I was thinking about this. There are so many examples, it's hard to choose. But I thought of a couple that I think really illustrate the scale. So one is, again, speaking of pandas, this is a panda named Ming. So Ming was evacuated from the London Zoo on the first day of the war. There was a select group of animals, the kind of major megafauna from the London Zoo, that were evacuated to a local animal park, about 35 miles outside of London. But, during the middle of the Blitz, Ming was brought back as a way to boost morale. And
Is
so
that
there were
right?
all kinds of public ceremonies. There were posters featuring Ming, and he was dressed like an air raids precautions worker. So he would have his hat and he would have his gas rattle and his rationing tickets ready to do his patriotic duty. And the idea was that, okay, Ming is back from the countryside. So he's no longer in hiding, and we British are, we're not going to stand down to Hitler. Like, we're going to fight. So if Ming can survive the Blitz, so can we. And so zoos often photographed or did staged photographs of animals engaged in patriotic tasks. So a
Mm.
chimp at the San Diego Zoo was photographed filling sandbags. Another chimpanzee in Detroit was photographed taking shots with a rifle at
Uh, plant,
Hirohito.
planting a victory garden.
Oh, yes, they would do these sort of things. There were images where going into the orangutan cage with the draft card and holding the draft card out. So they were meant to be funny, but they were just part of this constant patriotic messaging, right?
Hmm, hmm,
You know, uh, so a more famous and a more tragic example took place in Japan, right? And this is, right around 1943. The war was going really badly for Japan. So the Tokyo governor decided that the zoo should carry out a group of morale or propaganda killings, right?
hmm.
And these were meant to convince the Japanese people of the need to sacrifice, that the war was going so badly that we really, the Japanese people really needed to buckle down. So a number of the animals were euthanized, right? And the
Mm,
most famous victims were three elephants that were allowed to starve to death.
mm,
And this was a lesson for the nation. And at the end of it, the animals were given an official funeral. Children were brought in. High-ranking government officials were brought in, right? And it was literally designed as an example of, these animal deaths are just an example of what we have to be willing to do
mm.
in order to win this war, right?
Wow.
And of course, in Nazi Germany, you'd find zoos festooned with swastikas. You'd have signs saying things like "No Jews allowed." You would have anti-Semitic displays. Top Nazis would be photographed at zoos. Joseph Goebbels liked to talk about zoos all the time. He would integrate zoo messages into his propaganda. He would talk about kind of the ferocity of lions versus the backwardness of monkeys and apes, and he would translate these so-called biological lessons into his lessons about race and nation, right? And you would have, I mean, Hermann Goering liked to go to the zoo and get photographed. Mussolini would drive around with pet lion cubs. Winston Churchill liked to go and visit the lions in the zoo. And so, the zoo was always a place where you could expect to find all kinds of patriotic displays, fundraising, animals, uh, engaged in various kinds of war work.
Hmm. Hmm.
Even though zoos often like to sort of present themselves as a kind of refuge from the horror of war, right? If it was impossible to go to a zoo without sort of feeling the effects of war, right? And so
Hmm.
yeah, so the this kind of link between propaganda and zoos was very much apparent during World War II.
Yeah, fascinating. As I recall, you told me a story as well about the Soviet Union and the way that they treated their animals, which was quite different from the Japanese example.
Yeah, that's and this is one of the again, you have very diff I actually talk about the Japanese example and Soviet example in a chapter and compare the two. So basically, one of the most famous kind of ways in which, zookeeping was politicized during World War II took place in Leningrad. So during the siege of Leningrad, this is a time in which there was mass starvation, right? You have people, animals disappearing on the street, people eating boiling kind of joiner's paste and
Yep.
eating everything possible,
Mm,
like just trying to get any kind of precious calories, right? And
mm, mm,
in the past, like during the siege of Paris during the Franco-Prussian War in the 19th century, a lot of the animals were shot and were eaten. And of course, this was a time in which you could sort of, people were starving in Leningrad.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and you could expect people to come in and shoot the animals, shoot the hippo, right, and eat them.
mhm,
If
mhm,
not, as a way of saving food. But that's not what happened, right? In fact, the very opposite happened. Uh, you have the zoo, but also the entire community coming together to feed the animals, right? And they were starving, they were hungry. You have the zookeepers like giving away their own animals, right? But they were
mm,
determined to keep their animals alive, right? So whereas in Japan you have this message of these animals have to be sacrificed in order for us to win. Um, in the Soviet Union have the opposite message, which is like we need to sacrifice in order to keep these animals alive, right? Because this is our way of showing our willingness to push back. This is our willingness to show that Hitler is not going to change who we are, right? If we can keep these animals alive, this is a symbolic gesture, but an important one that says that we cannot be defeated. And at the end of the war, a lot of the animals did survive. In fact, the zookeepers were given orders of merit from the Soviet government. And in fact, to this day, even though Leningrad was renamed St. Petersburg, it's still called the Leningrad Zoo, in honor of the zookeepers who, kept the animals alive during the siege of Leningrad during World War II. And so even to this day, this kind of there's a kind of propaganda effort involved in sort of taking this story of what happened in the 1940s and using it as a sign of, here in Russia, we love animals, right?
Mm.
And this is something that nations often do at wartime. If once you start to notice it, you can't unnotice it. But often you'll see nations saying, "We're good to animals," and they are cruel to animals, right? And this is why, another reason why they needed to be invaded, right? So the United States would always, cast itself as a nation of animal lovers, right? Well, to this
Mm.
day, the Soviet Union or Russia will say, we're a nation of animal lovers. Like, when we could have been cruel, we refused not to. Now, Soviet Union was cruel in all kinds of ways, right? But one symbolic thing that they did was um, they thought it was important for propaganda reasons, for symbolic reasons, to keep these animals alive, right? So this is, just another example, and uh, uh, nations all over the zoos all over the world were trying to sort of grapple with this idea of, uh, how best to, send the right message, right? And for some, sending the right message meant being willing to destroy your animals for the good of the war effort. But for others, it meant, trying to do everything possible to save your animals as a way of boosting home front morale.
Yeah, this is all fascinating stuff, John, and I could just ask a whole bunch of follow-on questions. So in typical Cognitive Crucible John Bicknell fashion, let me try to describe to you what I'm thinking, and hopefully a question cascades out of it. So it's really interesting hearing, so you described three different ways that animals were used during World War II to do different things. Whether it was like some kind of patriotic duty or resilience in for the Soviet Union, or like stern determinism and stick-to-itiveness in the case of Japan. But the common thing is animals, and it just seems to me that um, we are in fact animals, and so there's kind of a kinship there between all animals, between all animals, and so using zoo animals or any animals for some kind of it seems like animals easily lend themselves to like wriggle their way into our brains and influence us in a whole bunch of different ways. And so I guess I'm curious how you can relate the experiences of humans during wartime and animals and zoos and kind of munge all that together.
Mhm. And this is so fascinating, and I think it's at the heart of why this story matters to people, right? Because yes, there was at the time, just as today, people felt an immediate, emotive, affective connection to animals, right? That one thing I like to point out is that, when art museums, for example, thought they were going to be bombed, right? They would take the art out and bury it underground, or they would take it up to, in Britain, they would take it out of London and put it up in a castle in Scotland and essentially forget about it. But of course, you can't do that with animals. Animals are living beings, right? And so when people would go and visit the zoo, right? They would have this kind of connection with animals, but they would also have this sense that animals, you know, are innocent, right? And this kind of gets me back to where I started. But because they were innocent, they don't know what's going on, right? They don't understand why their food rations have suddenly been cut, or they don't understand why the night sky is suddenly exploding with shrapnel and incendiaries, right? They don't understand, what happens when suddenly their keepers run away, or they don't understand these kinds of decisions. But because people do, they're able. they're able to kind of recognize in this relationship, this real empathy and tragedy. Like one thing that war does is it highlights this empathy between humans and animals because during war people understand what it's like to be hungry or to be scared or to be hurt or to feel this loss of control over your life, right? It doesn't matter what you do, you could still be bombed at any moment. And once they start thinking about themselves as kind of lacking that control, immediately they start to see connections between, other creatures, other beings in that same situation. So, World War II, ironically, was a period of great kind of an outpouring of zoo love where people would, declare their affection for animals. But it was also this period of real criticism toward the zoo, right? People pushing back on the zoo, saying, having gone through this war, this makes me rethink what it means to put the zoos and animals in this position. One thing that I think will interest you that um, at the Portland Zoo, for example,
Mhm.
a bald eagle was caught or rescued way out to sea, right? And it was brought in and it was placed in the Portland Zoo, right? And so, on the one hand, the Portland Zoo thought it was doing a great thing because it had taken this symbol of America that was going to die and brought it in. But a lot of people were outraged, right?
Hmm.
They were outraged with the idea that this symbol of American freedom would be locked in this zoo cage, right? And they would say, here's how we're fighting this war for freedom and liberty, and you've taken the one symbol of America and put it in this zoo cage, right? And so you know, there was specific concern about this particular kind of animal, but it bled into this broader sort of anti-zoo criticism, which was basically, that this war is sort of teaching us just how willing we are to decide that some zoo animals need to be euthanized, or some zoo animals need to be sent away, or some animals are better off, fed and others dead.
Hmm.
And so, it really did bring about this real reckoning with our relation, but it's all rooted in this kind of love and fascination with animals, and but a sense that they are somehow fundamentally innocent in a way that humans aren't, right? So,
Uh, the bald eagle story that you mentioned, that also was during World War II?
yes, that was in 1943.
Wow.
And what was
Yeah.
interesting is that the head of the Portland Zoo wrote to the National Zoo. William Mann was the head of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. And, this is part of this bigger story, but there were all kinds of relationships going on and, people asking for advice and so forth. And the Portland Zoo basically asked the National Zoo, say, hey, we're getting a lot of criticism. What should we do about it?
Mm.
And the National Zoo said, just tune them out. Right? People are always upset at zoos. Like you just got to let it go. Keep the animal. And he basically made the argument that if the animal is alive, it's got to be happy, right?
Mm. Hmm.
If it's dead, then that was a sign that it wasn't happy. So if it's still alive, so which is a
Hmm.
logic that allows you to say that, well,
Wow. Yeah.
you can keep anything, right? But
Well, that's I remember reading somewhere like way back this might have been in the Middle Ages or the 1600s or something like that, and doctors or physicians or scientists back then were experimenting on animals or on dogs or
Mhm.
trying to figure stuff out, right? And I just remember so clearly that this the common wisdom of the day was that animals didn't really have feelings, and so if these animals that you're operating on, these dogs were yelping and squealing and all this kind of, just ignore it. they can't really feel it.
Right.
I don't know what they're doing there, but don't worry, they don't have feelings like us, which is,
Yeah.
but even back in in the 1940s, I mean, this is still living memory. People had outlooks like you were describing.
Yeah, Rene Descartes said that, an animal yelping is basically like a broken clock, the sort of grinding of gears of a broken clock.
Mm.
It's not a sign of anything, right? It's just mechanical. So,
Hmm.
the zoos, they knew better by this point, but they were also very much willing to, I mean, they were always trying to kind of walk this line between, they had a number of different sort of constituencies. On the one hand, they had, they knew they had to kind of provide entertainment and they'd be a resource for the community. So people wanted to see zoos, right? They also had to keep the animals alive. And then they also had a broader mission, right, which would become increasingly important, I argue, because of World War II. Which is that, in the aftermath of World War II and the aftermath of both the Holocaust and the atomic bomb, people in zoos really began to recognize that, hey, life on Earth could be endangered, right? We've created weapons that allow us to destroy life on Earth. So we need to get much more on board with things like conservation and species protection and so forth. So those were things that zoos kind of considered before the war, but it's in the aftermath of World War II that we really see that.
All right. Wow. Well, I'd like to, maybe wrap it up a little bit and then conclude in our typical fashion by asking you a research question. But do you think maybe you could, take this, back up to the top and, relate some of these lessons, of zoos in wartime and some of the global challenges and that
Mhm.
you were talking about earlier?
Well, this is, I end the book actually thinking about this exact topic, so I'm glad you asked. I point out that on the one hand, you can walk away from this book thinking that the story of zoos during World War II is a story of survival, right? You've got people against impossible odds, zookeepers and their allies managing to stay open to save the lives of many of their animals. And they did all kinds of other things too, especially zoos that were under occupation, right? Some carried out resistance activities against the Nazis. They hid people, and I talk about this in Amsterdam, for example. And they did this often by getting creative, right? They knew when they had to bend the rules, and they knew when to stubbornly resist, right? They had to make tough choices, but they also recognized that, if they used many of the lessons from the rest of the war, they could survive. So zoos built victory gardens, right? Zoos carried out evacuation operations, right? Zoos had security protocols. Zoos basically mirrored everything that went on in the zoos in the rest of the world. So, and they did it by working hard, being creative, all of those sort of things. So, on the one hand, you could say that, and uh, I talk about how the zoo should be a real ally in the fight against climate change and, coming up
Hmm.
with very practical solutions for how to keep creatures, animals, humans alive in difficult circumstances. So zoos are good at that. Uh, Saving animals, I don't think is enough. They need to, if we're going to survive, we need to be invested in the planet. We need to be invested in sort of new ways of living. Zoos can play a big role in sending a message about how about the benefits of conservation, that sort of thing. At the same time, however, I think zoos have a lot of work to do. And I mentioned this early on that we can point to all kinds of good zoos, and the best zoos in the 21st century are miles ahead of zoos even in the 1940s. We're talking about zoos with amazing kind of immersive exhibits and artificial
I was
environment.
I was going to say, do you have like a favorite zoo yourself, or
Yeah, I do.
is there a zoo or two, like globally even, that is just like, if you've got the time and resources to visit this zoo, do it. What would it be?
Well, I mean, so my zoos actually would be somewhat unusual, right?
Okay, okay.
My favorite zoo actually is a zoo called Whipsnade, right? And it's about 35 miles outside of London. It's the zoo where Ming the panda was evacuated, and it almost looks like just a giant farm up on top of this plateau, and the animals just have a lot of room. There's no sense that you're not there's no effort to convince you that you're in some kind of jungle or anything. They're just animals are just out there. And the animals that are out there are climate appropriate, right? So there's no effort to put this, you know, alligator in kind of Great Britain, right? So, I think we've got this idea that, a good zoo has to have A, B, C, D animals, no matter what the climate. I think a good zoo, the best zoo, is a zoo that sort of recognizes that, we're not going to have every animal everywhere, but, we can sort of, attune the animals to the climate and not try to play. So that's one of my favorite zoos. Another one of my favorite zoos is actually in Vienna, Austria. And it's a zoo that is in a former flak tower, right?
Oh.
So a World War II era flak tower that was set up to, shoot down enemy bombers, right? And so it's a giant pillar, right in the middle of the city, and it's a zoo slash aquarium. And what you do is you go in from the bottom, you go all the way up to the top, and at the top there is a little museum to show what the flak tower was like in World War II. And then eventually you sort of start making your way down, and you go down, and there are artificial environments as you go, like almost like a little jungle with monkeys. And, you go down, and then you're at the bottom. And what I like about that is it's a zoo that's kind of in the middle of the city, right? So that it's not, say, taking 500 acres, right? And kind of creating this artificial environment. Here, we're using existing architecture, right? And putting animals in it. And so that's what I mean by saying that zoos need to get creative, right? So rather than having this trying to recreate the savannas of Africa, um, which is easy in places like Southern California, right? San
Hmm.
Diego Zoo,
Hmm.
their wild animal park, right? It's you've got a lot of land, you've got a good climate, right? So you can do that sort of thing, but don't try to do that in Hamburg, right? Instead, in Vienna, try to do something where you're essentially taking animals and bringing them into new places, exciting places, places that where going to the zoo is not necessarily this kind of this special treat, or this kind of there's no sense in which you're trying to escape the city and going off into nature. Rather, recognize that the nature and city are all kind of one and the same.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think, I go to a lot of zoos, and I've visited a lot of bad zoos. And most animals live in cages that are basically unchanged since the birth of the zoo in the 18th century, right? So
Mm.
it's, we can point to these amazing zoos in Berlin and Poland and Austria, and even the Vincennes Zoo in Paris is has these amazing kind of artificial mountains. But most zoo animals are in these kind of small iron cages. There are a lot of roadside zoos. And they all kind of send this message that, we can take kind of the most amazing animals of nature and just sort of lock them up in these small little environments. And I think ultimately that's a hard sell if we're really invested in kind of making these sort of thinking kind of structurally about the future of the planet and environmentalism and all the kind of political uh, side effects of that.
Yeah, that's good stuff. So I dropped links to those two zoos, the Whipsnade Zoo near London, and I looked it up. I think it's the House des Mires.
Yep, that's right.
I probably pronounced that incorrectly in Vienna. Really interesting stuff. All
It's
right.
a fascinating place.
Yeah. There's a cool little picture of that flak tower that you
Hmm.
described from World War One that the zoo kind of encompasses, or that.
And there's even a kind of a climbing course on the outside. So it's got you can, if you're into rock climbing, like you can go and climb the side of it. So it's really a place where it's bringing all kinds of people together, in one place. So
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll put it on the bucket list.
yeah.
Okay, so wrapping up, John, fascinating discussion. So if there are any people listening who would like to advance some of the knowledge in this space, what are a couple of research questions that people might consider tackling?
One thing, like a real basic question would be, what roles can zoos play in 21st century conservation efforts, right? No matter where you are on climate change, I think most of us can recognize that conservation is good for the planet, good for nations, good for the United States. So, what roles can zoos play? What are their limitations? If you're interested in contemporary politics, you might be interested in what can we do to limit the suffering of zoo animals caught up in contemporary military conflicts, such as those in Ukraine and in Gaza. At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, for example, there were a number of animals that were evacuated out of Ukraine over to places like Romania. But not all animals were, and some, in fact, were taken from Ukraine and taken back to Russia. And of course, the irony is that during World War II, animals were taken from Ukrainian zoos, except this time they were taken over to Germany. I would be interested in having more, especially policy people, thinking about how governments can use institutions like zoos to leverage their power and influence on the global stage. When we think about propaganda, we are often thinking about, you know, explicit messaging, or we're thinking about news and things like that. But of course, I make an argument that even places like zoos kind of can be sites of messaging and propaganda and influence. I think, and this is a bit more abstract, but I think it's important to recognize that war is not the only danger facing zoo animals, right? In recent years, we've seen zoo animals dying in floods, in wildfires, earthquakes, droughts, famines, social, political unrest, and often. This is not, or at least I would argue that this is not inevitable, right?
Hmm.
That in some ways we kind of manufacture a sense of vulnerability around certain groups, right? Zoo animals are one of the most vulnerable, right? Because they're literally kept in these places that they were not, necessarily meant to be. But I think one thing we'll want to ask is like, what's the best way we can ensure the most vulnerable, human and animal, don't bear the brunt of disasters, right? And I think just looking at what's happened over the last year in places like Asheville, North Carolina, or even across the center of Florida, right? We're seeing a lot of communities impacted by some of these climate tragedies, right? And so we want to kind of plan for them and think about what we can do in advance of them. So those would be some of the bigger research questions I would have.
Right. Well, fascinating discussion, John, for sure. And uh, we wish you all the best with your new book. The new book is World War Zoos, humans and other animals in the deadliest conflict of the modern age. And we will have a link in the show notes for our audience to go check out more information about this book and your work in general. And with that, Dr. John Kinder, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Oh, it was my pleasure for sure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.